Hello, welcome, and I'm David Brenneman. David Brenneman, Director of Collections and Exhibitions, and also Francis B. Bunzel Family Curator of European Art at the High Museum, and also Managing Curator of Dali, Salvador Dali, the late work. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Michael R. Taylor, who is the Muriel and Philip Berman Curator of Modern Art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. He has quite an impressive resume, and I have a really wonderful biography here. It actually makes me quite jealous and envious. His most recent exhibitions at the Philadelphia Museum include Picasso and the Avant-Garde in Paris, 2010, Marcel Duchamp, Étant Donné, 2009, Arshil Gorky, a retrospective, 2009, and I think we actually lent a very good painting to that retrospective of Gorky. And perhaps most relevantly to this exhibition, Salvador Dali, the Centennial Retrospective in 2004-2005. And also Giorgio de Chirico and the Myth of Ariadne in 2002. Michael studied at the Courtauld Institute in London, where he received his both master's and doctorals. He wrote his master's on the British pop artist Richard Hamilton, and then his dissertation on Marcel Duchamp's ready-mades. He's published widely on Duchamp, Dada, Surrealism. In 2009, he co-curated with Carlos Basualdo the Bruce Nauman exhibition at the American Pavilion for the 53rd Venice Biennale, and he was actually the winner of the Golden Lion Award for the Best National Pavilion, which is very impressive. I don't know if you were aware, but the High Museum this past summer organized the American Pavilion for the Architectural Biennale, and we were really hoping for the Golden Lion, but we did not get that. But Michael has that trophy. Future projects include an exhibition on surrealism in the 40s that will use original designs by Marcel Duchamp and Frederick Kiesler to partially recreate the 1947 International Surrealist Exhibition in Paris. In 2010, which is this year, Dr. Taylor's book, Marcel Duchamp, Étant Donné, won the George Whittenborn Prize for Outstanding Research and Scholarship in the field of art history, and was also awarded the first prize for Best Museum Permanent Collection Catalog by the American Association of Art Museum Curators. It was really Michael's symposium and subsequent book, The Dali Renaissance, which took place during the retrospective in Philadelphia, that really made us think that perhaps an exhibition on the late Dali would be something that we should do. And it was actually in that book and that symposium that Elliot King participated, and that ultimately led us to Elliot, who was our guest curator and who's here with us tonight in the audience. There he is, Elliot. So please join me in welcoming Michael Taylor to Atlanta.
Thanks everyone for coming. Great to be here. What a fascinating show. When we had the retrospective, we devoted a significant portion of the exhibition to the so-called late Dali, but we were amazed to see the response to that work, both by artists and younger people, especially students. It was clear that it spoke to them in ways that were sort of unprecedented in our thinking. And, you know, there's been a great deal written about Dali after 1940 since, and I think this exhibition will be seen as a landmark in that sort of retrieval of his later work. And I was thrilled to be asked to talk because I just find Dali's work fascinating and difficult, and I think we have to find a language to talk about it. It's very complex. And so tonight is a wonderful occasion to really sort of start to think about, especially his work from the 50s, which I think remains, despite Eliot's brilliant scholarship, there's a lot more to do, and I think that this is the beginning of something amazing. So, my first slide really sort of gets to the heart of it, God and the atom. Here we go. In December 1951, Salvador Dali announced his newfound interest in the pictorial possibilities of nuclear physics and molecular chemistry at a press conference in London, where he declared himself to be, quote, the first painter of the atomic age, and dismissed all the works he had produced up until this point as merely evolution. The devastating destruction of the Japanese city of Hiroshima in August 1945 by a nuclear fission bomb with a yield of 15 kilotons, equivalent to the force of 15,000 tons of TNT, had forced Dali to rethink both the subject matter and the spatial complexities of his subsequent paintings. On August 6, 1945, a flash 1,000 times brighter than the sun illuminated the sky above Hiroshima. And this is the city 3 days later. This flash was immediately followed by a wave of incandescent heat, and a few minutes later, a ferocious hurricane that swept away everything in its path. The terrifying heat turned the city into a gigantic inferno, which in turn generated a violent wind, followed by black rain. By mid-afternoon, the entire city was destroyed. At least 80,000 people were killed in the explosion, and almost as many suffered serious life-threatening injuries. In the weeks that followed, many more were to die in terrible agony from the burns they sustained after the initial blast, or from the effects of radiation, which caused internal bleeding, cancer, and leukemia. How could an artist like Salvador Dali, whose work was based on an intuitive, paranoid, critical understanding of the social and political events of his time, not be profoundly affected by the tragic events at Hiroshima, which had revealed the seemingly unlimited destructive capacity of nuclear weapons, as well as the near impossibility of protecting oneself against their pernicious effects, including the long-term consequences of ionizing radiation? The atomic explosion of August 6, 1945, shook me seismically, Dali later recorded. Thenceforth, the atom was my favorite food for thought. Many of the landscapes painted in this period expressed the great fear inspired in me by the announcement of that explosion. In his 1945 painting, Melancholic Atomic Uranic Idyll, the awesome destructive power of the atomic bomb is not conveyed through the familiar symbol of the mushroom cloud, but rather through an accumulation of associative images, ranging from a stylized fireball-like explosion, and I hope you can see that. Where's my laser? Here we go. Here. To American baseball players, warplanes, and elephants with insect-like legs, all of whom hit, drop, or release deadly egg-shaped bombs. From little league to little boy was not such a huge leap for Dali's fertile and elastic imagination to make, while the pellet-dropping pachyderms on stilts surely equate indiscriminate aerial bombing with the terrifying threat in antiquity of Hannibal's mighty elephants. As the French existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre argued in his 1946 essay, War and Fear, living with the threat of nuclear war was the beginning of the age of abstract mass murder. And this is Sartre. In other times, one risks one's life against the lives of others. One saw one's dead enemies in close proximity. One could touch their wounds. But today, atomic warfare meant unleashing catastrophic destruction from afar. Without taking a risk, Sartre concluded, one dies for nothing. This form of existential angst is clearly discernible in Dali's melancholic painting, which references the living nightmare of the threat of nuclear annihilation in a post-Hiroshima world. It is a somber work whose iconography remains indebted to the artist's earlier surrealist vocabulary of melting watches and double images, and thus fails to convey the explosive force of energy released from matter. Dali's next effort in this vein, the Three Sphinxes of Bikini of 1947, was also firmly rooted in pre-existing ideas about paranoid double images, despite his statements of the time that he was no longer interested in the psychopathological, and that all of his future paintings would be influenced by the atomic bomb. Like Leonardo da Vinci before him, Dali had an uncanny knack for perceiving hidden or composite images in the natural world, often taking advantage of the slightest coincidences of shape and color to ingeniously transform one image into another, as in this work, which takes as its subject matter the operations Crossroads nuclear weapons tests carried out on the Bikini Atoll, near the isolated Marshall Islands in the Pacific Ocean in the summer of 1946. The bulbous mushroom-shaped clouds caused by these detonations take the form of human heads, seen from the back, with smooth necks and white plumes for hair, while anthropomorphic forms are repeated in the shape of a clump of trees in the middle distance. The suspended animation of Later Atomica of 1947 to 49 represents a more convincing approach to the artist's stated aim of recuperating the traditional techniques of the old masters in order to interpret the new conception of physics. The mysteriously levitating objects in this painting reveal Dali's new understanding of nuclear physics, including such key concepts as the discontinuity of matter and the dissolution of gravity. Everything in the painting appears to float in a weightless atmosphere in which nothing touches, thus confirming to the recent scientific notion that particles do not touch at the atomic level. As his subsequent paintings of the late 1940s and early 1950s attest, the artist sought to replicate nuclear fission through the dematerialization of figures and objects in paintings that often take as their subject matter traditional Christian iconography, such as the Madonna and Child, and the crucifixion. The artist called this hybrid combination of atomic age physics and Catholic doctrine nuclear mysticism, and its application can be seen in the first version of the Madonna of Port Le Gap, where the changes in matter resulting from an atomic explosion are parallel to the physical and spiritual transformation of the praying Madonna, who carries the Christ child in the rectangular window space of her perforated belly. By 1951, Dali could claim, without any hint of irony, that he was painting, quote, in constant explosion. In nuclear bombing, from the scientific point of view, it is possible to approach the real mystery of life, end quote. The artist thus formulated a positive response to the implications of living in the nuclear age, which he would expand upon in his mystical manifesto, published in Paris in April 1951. The two most subversive things that can happen to an ex-surrealist in 1951, Dali wrote, are first, to become a mystic, and second, to know how to draw. The artist went on to describe himself in the Mystical Manifesto as a mystic in the Spanish tradition of St. Teresa of Avila or St. John of the Cross, and promised to use his ecstatic mystical reveries to imaginatively interpret the latest scientific advances of his age. Dali's embracement of what he called militant Spanish mysticism and his related efforts to reinvigorate modern painting through the utilization of the techniques and religious iconography of the Italian Renaissance were thus inextricably linked with his understanding of recent scientific discoveries, most notably atomic energy and quantum physics. According to Dali, it was up to the mystical, ultra-individualist artist in a state of ecstasy to resolve the new golden sections of the soul of our time. And the Mystical Manifesto ends with the prediction that his next painting, The Christ of St. John of the Cross, which is on the far side, would contain more joy and beauty than anything that would have been painted up until the present. I want to paint a Christ that will be the absolute contrary in every respect to the materialist and savagely anti-mystical Christ of Grunwald, which I'm showing you near me. Dali's Mystical Manifesto was intended to usher in a new era of mystic painting that would replace what he perceived to be the bureaucratic formulas of pseudo-decorative abstract modern art, as seen here in the work of Mondrian and Pollock, for example, whose work he compared to the gangrenous sores of Christ's body in the Eisenheim altarpiece. However, the optimistic message about the nuclear age presented in the Mystical Manifesto and subsequent paintings, including the Christ of St. John of the Cross, set his ideas apart from those of his contemporaries, such as the Italian artist Enrico Baj, a founding member of the nuclear art movement in Milan, whose work in the early 1950s took a pessimistic, apocalyptic view of the destructive potential of the atomic bomb to unleash a nuclear holocaust in which the victims would be reduced to the shadowy immateriality of radiation. Inspired by the free-flowing emulsified colors of Jackson Pollock's monumental paintings in the Peggy Guggenheim collection in Venice, Enrico Baj began creating improvised, quasi-figurative paintings in oil and enamel paint, in which free forms swirl, spill, and pools of color are used to suggest radioactive wastelands or biological mutation. The familiar mushroom cloud of the atomic bomb is occasionally discernible in Baj's gestural paintings and drawings of this period, such as the appropriately named Little Boy of 1951. Baj's title refers to the uranium bomb dropped on Hiroshima by the B-29 Enola Gay, which was given the nickname Little Boy by American scientists in reference to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The plutonium bomb was dubbed Fat Man for British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. He didn't like that. Baj intended his work to reference the very real threat of a nuclear inferno, in which all human existence could be vaporized in a single instant. However, the title also suggests a second meaning for the work, namely the hideous side effects of radiation, such as birth defects and leukemia, which were addressed in numerous works by the artist during this period. From the time of the first atomic bomb, he later recalled, I saw humanity living in a constant state of terror and alarm as the end of the world approached. As his writings and public statements attest, the nuclear age for Baj meant living on a knife edge, keeping a delicate balance between the hopes of unlimited scientific progress, and I think you see that in this sort of object of fascination here, a man looking at an atom, as well as the risks of total destruction brought on by a man's innate aggressiveness and stupidity. In October 1951, Baj and his close friends Joe Colombo and Serge D'Angelo launched the nuclear art movement in Milan, which took the form of a series of group exhibitions that lasted until 1957, by which time they had been joined by such notable contemporaries as Yves Klein and Piero Manzoni. In February 1952, Baj and D'Angelo published a manifesto of nuclear painting in Brussels, in which they warned of the inherent dangers of the misapplication of nuclear technology, while at the same time recognizing the need to reinvent painting in the atomic age. All forms disintegrate, they wrote. The new forms of man are those of the atomic universe. The forces are electric charges. Ideal beauty no longer belongs to a cast of stupid heroes, to robots. It coincides with the representation of nuclear man and his space. In the next few years, the group would explore this double-edged sword idea of unlimited scientific progress on the one hand and the risk of catastrophic global annihilation on the other, in which Baj's paintings of ravaged toxic landscapes and viscous mutated figures can be contrasted with Colombo's fantastical visions of futuristic nuclear cities, where man could exploit the advances in atomic science to create a new way of living. On April the 28th, 1952, the Milan newspaper Corriere Lombardo published an extended article by Jack Schmiel on Salvador Dali, in which the Catalan painter spoke of his interest in nuclear mysticism. The piece began with a detailed account of the artist's special audience with Pope Pius XII on November the 23rd, 1949, during which Dali had presented his first version of the Madonna of Port Lagat to the pontiff, who exhibited what the artist described in Time magazine as an extraordinary comprehension of his modern approach to religious painting. The work met with the Pope's approval, and in the spirit of a holy year, he blessed the painting, thus paving the way for the artist's gradual acceptance by the Catholic Church, despite his vehement anti-clerical stance of the 1920s and 1930s. This meeting encouraged Dali to pursue his interest in nuclear mysticism, and he went on to describe how his new paintings, and this is in this Milan newspaper article, he went on to describe how his new paintings, based on the new discoveries of the atomic physicists, would herald the end of the era of atheist materialism and rationalism that Dali claimed began with the French Revolution, since recent discoveries concerning the nature of energy and matter confirm that science and religion were once again becoming unified. Everything is in a state of dematerialization, Dali explained. No one can any longer be certain of anything. Even great scientists are turning to metaphysics. And he was thinking here of Einstein. Thus, a new mysticism is being born from the age of the atom, end quote. And here I would mention as a key source text Ronald A. Knox's God and the Atom, which Dali read in a Spanish translation published in Santiago, Chile in 1948, whose first chapter, entitled Trauma, begins with the atomic explosion in Hiroshima, before going on to make explicit connections between religion and science in the atomic age. Dali covered the entire front pages of this volume with pencil drawings depicting splitting atoms and nuclear explosions, thus providing us with crucial evidence of his excited reaction to reading this book, which is now preserved in the archives of the Fundación Gala Salvador Dali in Figueres, Spain. The Milan newspaper article ended with Dali's prediction that his next painting would be an explosive Madonna Atomica, which he eventually completed at the end of 1952, at which point he retitled it Assumpta Corpus Lapis Lazulina, after the sumptuous blue color that saturates the entire painting. Much to the chagrin of Baj, D'Angelo, and Colombo, their hometown newspaper made no mention of their own nuclear paintings and sculpture, which had been shown at the Gallery San Fedele in Milan just 6 months earlier. The group's anger at this omission was exacerbated by Dali's claims to be the first painter of the atomic age, as well as his efforts to unify science and religion under the rubric of nuclear mysticism, which had formulated a positive response to the advent of nuclear weapons that was diametrically opposed to their own cataclysmic vision of the world during the Cold War nuclear arms race that, to them, represented a form of state-level psychosis. While Dali was reading Ronald A. Knox's comforting vision of a nuclear paradise on Earth, in which the dangers of radioactive fallout never appeared to cross the author's mind, Baj and his colleagues in Milan were understandably paralyzed by fear by the American science fiction writer Robert A. Heinlein's 1940s short story Solution Unsatisfactory, which predicted the development of fiercely destructive radiological weapons by scientists working in the United States. And these weapons in the story were used to end the Second World War. It's fiction after all. After Berlin was covered in radioactive dust that contaminated the entire population of the city and its environs. But the power of these weapons was such that by the end of the story, only the imposition of a worldwide military dictatorship can prevent the inevitable planetary catastrophe. Against the advice of his colleagues, Enrico Baj decided to pursue legal proceedings against Dali, claiming that the Catalan artist had violated Article 6b of the Berne Convention, which protects an artist's copyright and royalties. In a court hearing in Milan, Baj claimed that Dali's statement to the press in April 1952 that he had conceived the original atomic mode of painting, which he had derived from nuclear physics, was demonstrably false, and he requested, under the rights afforded him by international law, that Dali be restrained from furthering his aim of establishing himself as the pioneer of nuclear art. At the Milan hearing, which took place in April 1953, Baj attempted to substantiate his own right to be recognized as the father of atomic art by referring to the exhibition of his nuclear paintings, such as Little Boy, which we saw earlier, and Immaculate Conception, which you see here, at the Gallery San Fedele in Milan in November 1951. According to the artist, his intention in these paintings was to symbolize the liberation of vast amounts of energy through nuclear fission, which is when the atom is split into two or more parts, as well as to highlight the deadly aftermath of the detonation of nuclear bombs, which create a host of unstable radioactive isotopes, both by burning their own nuclear fuel and by irradiating material close to the explosion site. The ironically titled Immaculate Conception reveals the shocking reality of radiation fallout, in which a disturbing fetus-like humanoid exists in a contaminated toxic environment that has led to its biological mutation. As art historian Stephen Peterson has persuasively argued, this viscous milky white creature, appearing to have 3 eyes, I think you can sort of see that there, can be compared to images of biological devolution and alien mutation, there we go, found in science fiction horror movies of the 1950s, especially The Thing from Another World, which we know that Baj and his nuclear colleagues saw when Howard Hawks' film was first shown in Milan, Italy, in 1951. Given Baj's admiration for Francis Picabier's work, especially from the Dada period, Immaculate Conception may also refer to the blasphemous Blessed Virgin of 1920, in which the ink block stains on an otherwise pristine white piece of paper can be read as the blood of defloration, menstruation, and childbirth, thus simultaneously suggesting the loss of Mary's virginity and the birth of Jesus Christ. Baj's three-headed atomic monster is also brought to life through an unconventional means, a mutant offspring born without a mother, the miraculous product of radioactive contamination. Baj went on to claim that several of these nuclear paintings were made in 1951. In other words, just before Dali began to publicize himself as the inventor of the art of the atomic age. Unfortunately, Baj was under the false impression that Dali had not actually made any paintings based on his new theories of nuclear mysticism, since the Milan newspaper article erroneously referred to the as-yet-to-be-completed Atomic Madonna as his first picture in this vein. Baj also appears to have been completely unaware that the artist had issued his mystical manifesto in 1951, in which he announced that he was embarking on a new era of mystical painting informed by quantum physics, in which matter would be represented in a constant and accelerated process of dematerialization, as seen in works such as Corpuscular Madonna and Raphaelesque Head Exploding. In the latter work, which Dali completed in 1951, and you can see it on the far side, he depicted the head of a Raphael Madonna disintegrating into a swirling mass of elementary particles, inspired by books on nuclear fission, and, in particular, the English astrophysicist Sir Arthur Eddington's The Nature of the Physical World. First published in 1928, this popular science book supplied Dali with his famous notion that, following the new concepts of modern physics, if one wanted to give an accurate representation of a table, instead of being compact, the table should instead resemble something like a swarm of flies. And I think you can very clearly see that sort of analogy working in these two paintings. The Tribunal of Milan found in Baj's favor when Dali failed to show up in court. However, since Dali divided his time between Port Legate, New York, and Paris, the Italian artist's attorney, Paolo Accetti, decided to summon him before the courts in Paris, requesting that an injunction be brought against Dali to prevent him from posturing as the inventor of nuclear painting. In the end, the Tribunal de la Seine ruled that since neither party was a French citizen, it could not rule on the case. Despite this setback, Baj and Accetti continued to relentlessly pursue the Catalan artist through the international courts, before the case finally ended at the Tribunal of Rome in June 1954, when Dali agreed to sign a legal document in the offices of Baj's lawyer, stating that he would never again declare himself to be the inventor of nuclear painting. And it is extremely telling that after 1954, Dali's work and rhetoric begins to move away from nuclear mysticism, which was replaced by new obsessions, such as the spiraling double helix of Francis Crick and James Watson's 1953 discovery of the molecular structure of DNA. In a recent telephone interview, Baj's nuclear art colleague, Sergio D'Angelo, told me that he had profoundly disagreed at the time with his friend's legal proceedings against Dali, which he thought were ridiculous and a lost cause, since the idea of nuclear painting was so widespread by the early 1950s that it would be impossible to prove who initiated it. To which I said, it was Dali. For example, Baj and D'Angelo were aware of a French artist called Germaine Jumard, who had published a manifesto of nuclear painting in Brussels that was reprinted in the French newspaper Ici Paris in June 1950. To say nothing of the all-over drip compositions of Pollock or the chaotic, heavily scumbled oil paintings of Volst, which were both interpreted at the time as symbolizing atomic energy and nuclear explosions. Much closer to home, the Argentinian-born Italian artist Lucio Fontana had launched the spatial art movement in Milan in 1947, which called for new art forms, using new materials to respond to recent scientific discoveries, including the destructive energy of the atomic bomb. Finally, D'Angelo conceded that it was the Italian futurist painter Fortunato de Pero who had coined the term nuclear painting in his 1915 Manifesto of Nuclear Painting and Plastics that was well known to all of the artists associated with the Milan Nuclear Art Group. Ironically, it had been D'Angelo who had brought Dali's claims to Baj's attention after hearing through a friend about the interview with the artist in a Spanish newspaper. In the Milan newspaper. He was in Spain at the time. "The nuclears are in danger," he wrote to Baj, since Dali had declared that upon returning to America, he will begin nuclear painting. The alarming tone of this missive, which contains a crucial error in that Dali made his paintings in Port Legat before shipping them to the United States for his annual exhibitions at the Carstairs Gallery in New York, may have provided the catalyst for the ensuing legal battles between Baj and Dali, especially after the Catalan artist repeated his claims in the international press. Although their objection to Dali followed the model provided by André Breton, who had fiercely rejected his work on the grounds that he was morally bankrupt, had succumbed to rampant commercialism, and had betrayed the Surrealist cause by embracing the beliefs of the Roman Catholic Church as well as fascism, I do not believe that Baj, D'Angelo, and Colombo did so to ingratiate themselves with orthodox surrealism, especially since Baj greatly admired the work and ideas of Francis Picabia. Throughout his career, he always pays reference to Picabia's work. Another renegade from the Surrealist movement and an outspoken critic of André Breton's authoritarian leadership of Surrealism. It should also be pointed out that D'Angelo and Colombo believed at the time that Baj was using the court cases as a publicity stunt to generate exposure for the nuclear art movement and to leave its mark in history. Fearing that the protracted legal proceedings would permanently end their friendship, D'Angelo told Baj that he would not participate in the court cases against Dali and left Italy soon thereafter. In the end, Baj and his colleagues thoroughly underestimated Dali's profound understanding of nuclear physics through his readings of Einstein, Eddington, Heisenberg, and Fermi, which far surpassed their own researches into this subject, as well as the intuitive, almost delirious nature of his work, which is much closer to Nietzsche's gay science or Alfred Jarry's pataphysics, the science of imaginary solutions, than has perhaps been previously thought. For as Dali told Playboy magazine in July 1964, painting is but one single mode of expressing my own cosmology, which enables me, through my genius and my paranoia, to create a synthesis of nature impossible even for the scientist, because the scientist is too much involved in his own specialization. Dali believed that it took a perverse polymath like himself, through his mystic reveries and fertile imagination, to come up with a paranoid critical interpretation of the creation, destruction, and reintegration of the universe. The irony here is that had Baj, D'Angelo, and Colombo embraced Dali's work and invited him to join their group, rather than censoring his contribution to nuclear painting through an extended legal battle, the nuclear art movement may have developed into a powerful alternative to the work of the abstract expressionists, then being heavily promoted in the United States by critics such as Clement Greenberg, Thomas B. Hess, and Harold Rosenberg. Dali shared the Milan group's antipathy towards the reductive formalism of abstract painting, as you saw earlier. He didn't think much of Mondrian. I don't know if you've all seen the Chaos and Creation film upstairs, but he sort of compares his paintings to troughs of pigs. It's a wonderful scene. And his optimistic and profoundly mystical vision of matter, constantly in the process of dematerialization and disintegration, although wildly divergent from their own doomsday scenarios of push-button nuclear warfare, only serves to highlight the simultaneously terrifying yet exciting possibilities for painting resulting from the Enola Gay's deadly 15-kiloton weapon. Thank you.
So I was interested to see the works by and the others. Where are these works? Are they in museums? Are they largely in private collections? I mean, where are they? How did you find them?
Mainly in Milan. these artists did not reach the international fame of Dali. So Enrico Baj goes on to do a series of paintings of generals, which are these kind of puffed up Ubu figures. Those are in museums. But these early works are mainly in the collection of his widow, Roberta, and she gave me access to them. I interviewed a lot of the artists associated with that group, as well as their dealer, Arturo Schwartz. He was sort of my point of entry because not only was Schwartz their dealer at the time, he later becomes Marcel Duchamp's dealer, so I've known him for a long time. He, of course, thought that Dali had ripped off all these artists, and what I realized in interviewing them was there was a real problem with chronology. You had to sort out the chronology, and that was really what this lecture was about.
So do you think that the works created by this group, are actually, great works and that they deserve to be in museums?
I don't think they're life-changing works in the way, say, the Pollock is. I think you have to remember they were all incredibly young. Colombo goes on to be a great designer of furniture. He has another career. They were all pretty much kids. They were listening to jazz. It was like after the Second World War. But they were heartfelt in what they were doing. And by the end of the 50s, they do get in contact with people like Yves Klein and Manzoni, and their work certainly is interesting to think of in this vein. But yeah, I would be interested for my museum in acquiring some of the work. I don't think Roberta wants to sell them. She sees them as sort of juvenilia. And I think the court case has the feeling of juvenilia. D'Angelo is the most interesting in discussing this because what he said was that it was really that they were sort of holding Dali up as fame-driven, yet they made sure that every newspaper was at that court trial, the first court trial. So weren't they doing the same thing? That's why he leaves Italy. He can't stand what's going on. He felt it was just very hypocritical to sue Dali and claim that he was a sellout while really sort of doing a very performative thing and having their catalogs and making sure their art was known. But I think it's an undiscovered aspect of all this. And to me, seeing this exhibition, having done all this research, was really a thrill because I could actually look at some of the paintings that were actually discussed in the trial. Yes, there's a question at the back.
You mentioned Dali's later enthusiasm for biology following the discovery of the double helix. And I know there's a couple pieces in this exhibit that have some DNA-like motifs, I seem to remember. But is there any parallel between the nuclear mysticism enthusiasm that Dali exhibited in his writings and any enthusiasm for biology later on? Did he have the same extent of cosmological excitement about biology as he did for nuclear physics?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we have to get into the mindset is someone who, he could read Scientific American magazine, and Elliot, I know, has poured through those magazines, and I have too. But he would not read them the way we would, because he has his own cosmology that he's mapping onto. And so he will just take little aspects, and I think it conjured up images for him. And all the time, you have to remember, he's a non-believer. He wants to believe in religion, but he's a non-believer. And so I think he's hoping that science can kind of provide a bridge. And he turns to biology, and I'm pretty convinced that this court case was sort of the end of him reading Heisenberg and people like that. It's a kind of awful thing that happens to him because he knows, he must know that he predated these younger artists, but to actually sit down and sign a piece of paper with Paolo Accetti, this powerful lawyer, was a horrible thing. And I think that the Crick and Watson discovery was a wonderful thing for him. He could suddenly, he met them, he would show them his art with the double helix. And I think, that's how I sort of see all of his approaches to science, even predating the 50s. I mean, I think you could go back to the beginning of his career. I mean, I think that he just saw the world differently. And I was saying to someone earlier this wonderful anecdote by Ultraviolet, where she said that they would watch movies together on TV, and it might be a Western, and then the Western would play, and then there'll be adverts, and then the Western would play again. And she would say, so what did you think of like High Noon or something? And he would say, I thought it was great, but why was the man brushing his teeth? Like, it just was, he had that imagination. He thought it was one, like, great film, which means that all the other adverts made sense to him. But, so, any other, yeah.
I'm curious, is Dali the only artist in the 50s and 60s that was actually taken to court? Or were there others? I don't recall hearing about any other court cases of something that may have arisen from jealousies.
I can't think of many. I mean, I think of Warhol being sued, because he was appropriating things like Brillo boxes that were other people's designs. It's a very hard thing to prove. I mean, and of course I always feel like these sorts of papers are like journeys that you don't know where you're going to go on. So I really had to read this Article 6b of the Berne Convention. And it's a very specific thing. I mean, what it's really about is forgeries. It's really protecting an artist from another artist coming along and making the same painting. Well, Dali's paintings look nothing like the Milan groups. So it sort of is an anomaly, but I'm sure there are other court cases, but I just don't know of them. It's an interesting question. There's another question down here.
Thank you. I don't have a very specific question. I was just wondering if you would be willing to elaborate any way you like on how subjects of nuclear painting had transcended into sci-fi films of the 1950s. And also if subjects of those films worked the other way around, if they had inspired any paintings.
Well, that is a great question and a big question. And I mentioned this guy, Stephen Peterson, because he's written a book on this subject that's really fascinating. And I think it goes both ways. I think that, for sure, artists like Enrico Baj and Serge D'Angelo, when they were seeing these science fiction films, they were becoming inspired by them. And you have to think about Richard Hamilton, who, as you mentioned, I did my master's thesis. He had Robbie the Robot at the This Is Tomorrow exhibition opening. And ironically, I don't know if anyone knows this, but Robbie the Robot's helmet stuck, which is what happened to Dali in the 1936 Surrealist exhibition. And they all thought he was joking, and he was like, and then finally they got him out of this diving suit. And then I found this out the other day, the Robbie the Robot character's helmet stuck. And so he sort of passed out. And everyone thought it was part of the fun of the opening. So it was a sort of history repeating itself. Now, as for the other way, there were a lot of science fiction illustrators, and I'm thinking of people like Gorman Powers, who illustrated L. Ron Hubbard's books. And he was inspired by people like Tanguy and Dali. I mean, science fiction really picks up on that hand-painted illusionism of surrealism in the 30s. And if you look at science fiction books in the 50s and 60s, they might be sort of, in outer space, but they're really dealing with the language that was developed by the surrealists, which, was in the 20s and 30s. And there's actually a conference at the Courtauld Institute, I think it's in January, on science fiction and surrealism. So it's a I don't know what your travel funds are like, but it might be worth a visit. So I think it does go both ways, and I think I don't see it with Dali though. It's funny. I think that he was rooted in another place. In fact, I think he didn't like science fiction, but certainly what we know about Baj and D'Angelo is that when they saw the thing from another world, it completely rocked their world. If you watch those movies now, they're so weird and clunky. But I showed you the posters. I mean, they were sort of terrifying. But we don't really live in that aftermath of Hiroshima. But that's what they took at it, because that film does have sort of specific things and kind of biological mutation was something that they really feared. The sort of after effects of all this, which Dali never really thinks about. Yes. Yeah.
So what your essay in the Dali Renaissance book was, really almost had me rolling on the floor, and it was about, it was about Dali's lecture tour in the United States in the early 50s, I suppose, and he was going all across the United States trying to explain nuclear mysticism to what must have been totally mystified groups of Americans all over the States. And so could you just speak very briefly about that? I mean, did in fact anyone understand it? They were largely amused by it, I assume, because he, first of all, had difficulty speaking English, correct?
Yeah. And we all know the famous word butterfly, which for him was boo. Eliot does this better, but like butterfly, like goes on for 15 minutes. He spoke with, he was going to places like Iowa, and he would have a blackboard and he would draw, atoms and nuclear diagrams. And I think people really thought of it as fun. But when you read, that was a very difficult thing to do, because I had to piece it all together, not only from his own writings, but from press accounts. If you read what he's saying, he's actually very serious. And I find that always with him. He was both the great self-promoter with the mustache, but beneath it all was actually one of the great thinkers of the 20th century. And I feel the same way about Warhol. Warhol, for all his blank stare, actually rethought contemporary art. We're still living in the moment of Warhol. So I think both of them are similar in the way that, communication wasn't their best approach. And so the idea of a Dali lecture was hysterical. People thought that it was just charming and funny, and they couldn't understand it, but it didn't matter because it was great, drama. But there was a serious message under there. And again, it sort of makes me feel like, well, what if he had actually met up with these other artists, and what if they were with him and had kind of could be part of a movement? Because Dali really is an individual. I think after he leaves surrealism, he leaves group activity. And it's very sad to think of like his late letters to Buñuel, where he wants him to sort of think about collaborating again, and Buñuel won't let him. And I think he missed colleagues. I think he wanted to have colleagues. But, that it's, you've read the essay. It was great fun to write. And Dali just takes you to these interesting places. And I love that.
Michael, thank you for coming to Atlanta.
Oh, thank you for coming.
Thank you, everyone.